And welcome to another edition of the Tech Guy off the radio. I am your host, Pete the Tech Guy. Have Fedora, season 18, Doctor Who scarf will travel. I've got it on my season 12 scarf. I've got it around here somewhere. And I am happy to spend, I figure will be maybe an hour, maybe a little bit more, maybe a little bit less, sharing thoughts on the stories of the week and so forth. Here on the Tech Guy off the radio, the live stream podcast. First, a little bit of housekeeping, so to speak. The podcast is normally at 9:30 a.m. on Fridays. We will return to that time next week. I had some family commitments that had to be taken care of, which is why we're at 3 p.m. today. Also, that we are going to be dropping the 12:35 a.m. Podcast that on Monday mornings. Although I made some good points last week. My wife was listening to the podcast as I was doing it, and as she put it, I was just too tired. I wasn't giving you a quality product. I mean, the arguments were good, and there was a lot that came up that confirmed what I was saying, but I don't want to I don't want to be exhausted. I don't want to give you a rushed podcast. For those of you who are hitting the tip jar or visiting, you deserve better than that. So we're going to just stick with the Friday live stream for now. If I have time to do another one, I will, but between the online baseball leagues, the face-to-face baseball league, my regular 40-hour-a-week job, the writing and everything else, and, having a life with my family, that's kind of difficult. So the No Frills, just me talking to you podcast every Friday, 9:30 a.m., except for today because of the situation. Well, let's get right into it. I had a different topic I wanted to start with, but I want to go with the Minnesota riots to begin with. And the killing that started it. And let's put things on the table to begin with. There's no reason to be using that kind of force on a guy who's kiking checks. Yeah, you arrested a guy. There's not a question of, the guy's kiking checks. He's not that big. He's probably not that big a danger. Now, in fairness to the police, I'm not a police officer. You never know when someone's going to be dangerous or not. But an objective look at the situation would say that the police officer overdid it. It would be very hard to say otherwise. In fact, yesterday on Rush's show, I was listening to it as I was driving. There was a police officer who had called in and said bluntly, we've been trained for stuff like this. This is all done wrong. That's, there's no way that this thing. And again, I'm not an experienced police officer. I'm nothing of that. But I would take the word of an experienced police officer. It's basically, there's absolutely no excuse for this. And the fact that the officer's been arrested is a good thing. The fact that he's been charged with, I believe, third-degree murder. I think the maximum penalty is 25 years. And 25 years is, for those of 25 years, that's not. If the guy's 30 or 40, 25 years is going to be a long time, assuming he gets a lot. And of course, he's entitled to a trial and defense and all of that, which, like any person being charged with a crime is. But that's all proper. And the government right away, and I should point this out because I think this is important. Right away, the president said we want to send a team. We're going to investigate for civil rights violations, which is proper. Now, the big thing that I want to say about this to begin with is that the outrage isn't that this happened to a black man by a police officer. The outrage is that it was done to a man by a police officer. If that had been a white guy, it'd be just as outrageous. If that had been a Spanish guy, it'd be just as outrageous. If that had been a transgender guy, it would be just as outrageous. If it was a Chinese guy, it would be just as outrageous. If it was a woman of any race, it doesn't matter. The race is irrelevant in terms of what the officer did. Now, I just don't see it. The problem is what the officer did. Who he did it to in terms of the crime is not relevant. We should not want police doing this type of thing. And police shouldn't want it doing that type of thing. And to reduce it to a racial thing is a mistake because it implies that if a police officer goes over the line, only sometimes it's okay. The outrage here is that it was done. That it was done to someone of color doesn't make it, to me, at least in my mind, more or less outrageous. What's outrageous is that it was done, and police officers aren't supposed to do that kind of thing. Now, the fact that people are upset about it is perfectly valid. It's absolutely valid. And I don't blame people for being upset, and I don't blame people for seeing it through a racial lens either. That's not the lens I look at it. I look at it as this is a police officer who went over the line and should be prosecuted accordingly. That's the way it should be looked at. Now, if people disagree, that's fine. Now, if people look at it strictly as a racial thing, of course, looking at history and the sorts, I don't have a problem with people doing that. I don't have a problem looking at it saying did he do that because of race? The fact that he did it is what matters the most. Now, of course, under some laws, the fact that the race of the person involved makes a difference. But for me, it doesn't make a difference. What makes a difference is that something wrong was done, and that prosecution should take place if it's valid. And the prima facie evidence is that it's valid. But that also does not mean that should be an easy thing for people to say. If you can't say that looking at that video, the policeman went over the line, you got a problem, in my opinion. I mean, just neutral, objective fact. If you can't see that there's a problem here, then you're not looking at it properly, in my opinion. That's my opinion. That's the opinion. I think that's the opinion of most people. But there's a second part to this. It's totally appropriate for people to protest on this. Obviously, not only because it's unjust, but because it's an injustice done in the name of the citizens of the city. The police officers are there as representatives of the city. They are allowed to use force, to use violence, basically, on behalf of the citizens. So as a citizen, you have every right to be upset about it. You have every right to protest it. Just as, for example, last month, although on a different subject, you had people protesting the shutdowns and the lockdowns. Every right to do that. Nothing wrong with protesting. First Amendment. It's great. However, there is not a First Amendment right to riot. There is not a First Amendment right to arson. There is not a First Amendment right to violence. That's the really thing that kills me about this. There is not a First Amendment right to violence, and it seems very strange to me that people are trying to suggest that there is, or that rioting is justified. I mean, you might understand it. It's like that episode of Spock, The Armageddon Factor, where they're killing each other. They're having a war, but people don't actually fight. They people go into disintegration chambers. And Spock's over there, quite understandably, he's over there. Oh, I'm glad you approve. He's over there. And I don't approve. I understand. I might understand why someone does something, but it doesn't matter. It's a riot. There are, 150, 170 businesses that were destroyed? Any of those business owners do that? Nope. Any of the people who live in that neighborhood do that? Nope. Any of those people responsible for that? Nope. And tell me, how does looting TVs from a Target mean justice for someone who was killed? And an officer's now been charged with third-degree murder. The officer being charged with third-degree murder, that's justice. Looting a Target is not, and it never has been. And the fact that people doing this and that people are excusing it or pretending it's not happening. I was seeing the video from MSNBC of their reporter insisting that, literally with something burning in the background, this is mostly peaceful. That's just nonsense. Why is it so hard for some people to say what the police officer did was wrong, he should be prosecuted for it, and what the rioters did was wrong, they should be prosecuted for it? That's not hard. What the police officer did wasn't wrong because he was a white officer and a black man. What was wrong was because what he did was wrong. What the rioters are doing is not wrong because they're black rioters or of any color they are. It's because looting and pillaging is wrong. None of those. First of all, none of those businesses had anything to do with it. But second of all, even if they did, that's not how the law works. Burning down the police station is wrong. Michael Moore saying, we need to burn down that police station in reparation. How does burning down a police station right the wrong? It doesn't. Prosecuting the officer. That's what rights the wrong. And prosecuting to the point where there is an incentive not to do this. Same with rioting. As long as you allow rioting, you're going to get more of it. As long as you reward it, as long as you make it clear that it's not going to be punished, you're going to get more of it. Violence is wrong. Whether it's violence by a police officer against a guy arrested for kiking a check, for God's sakes. Actually, it wouldn't matter what he was arrested for. The violence is wrong. And the police officer was not in danger of his life. I mean, if you had an officer, if someone's drawing a gun and you're in danger of your life, that's one thing. The officer wasn't in danger of his life. You can't, there's no way to explain it away. There is no way to explain that away. There's just no way to do it. And I'm not even going to try. Why would I want to try? What he did was wrong. He should be prosecuted. He's now been arrested. He's now been charged. Maybe some of the other officers involved who let it happen are going to be charged. Now, I wasn't there. I didn't take the video. I didn't see it. And I'm sure the defense is going to try and make a case for them. And that's what defense does. Same with the rioters. I wasn't there. I wasn't watching the riots last night. I was at work. But people who are identified as rioters and looters, they should be arrested. They should be prosecuted. They should have defense and brought before the court. That's how a legal system that doesn't involve a mob works. The reason why you have police is so that you do not have mob violence. I mean, people forget that police are there for police are, to serve and protect, to protect people. That's true. But it's not just to protect people who are innocent, but it's to protect people who are suspected of crimes. Because otherwise, you get a lynch mob with a rope looking to punish people. Or you get a guy with a shotgun looking to punish people. He touched my daughter, I'm going to blow him away. He robbed my store, I'm going to shoot him. He tried to hurt my brother, I'm going to get him. Is that the law you want? Because if you want that kind of law, you're going to find you're not going to like the new rules. Because those are the old rules. Those are the rules before the pre-civilized rules. You don't want that. Those actually are the rules in places like Chicago in the gang areas, or Baltimore in the gang areas, or LA in the gang areas, where black people are being shot every single day and people aren't rioting over it. Which is kind of disgusting in the sense that all these other people are dying. And I've talked about this on the podcast before, that it's only when people think it's useful that it becomes worth protesting. Which isn't saying much for the lives of these other black men who are being killed in Baltimore and in Chicago and in LA. Apparently those lives don't matter. Now, in fairness, those lives weren't ended by representatives of the citizenry. The police are representatives of the citizenry, and the citizens have the right to expect them to behave in a professional manner and to behave with the necessary restraint. And being a police officer is a tough job because your first job is to come home alive every day. And I don't minimize the risks that police take. People do not know the risks a police officer takes on your behalf. But if they cross the line, they cross the line. That's fairly simple. But if you want rule by mafia, I mean, my ancestry is Sicilian. Do you really want rule by the dons of the neighborhood? Do you really want that kind of rule? Because that's what you get when you allow anarchy, when you allow burnings, when you allow rioting. The violence is wrong and it shouldn't be done. And the leaders of the black community, or the self-appointed leaders, and the liberals of the left, and the people in the media should be speaking out against it, and should be speaking out against it loudly. Because first, it ain't going to solve anything. And secondly, it changes the subject away from the actual justice being done. But the point isn't, and this is what's really getting me about this. The point hasn't been about doing the right thing. The point is about fear and appeasement and politics. And it shouldn't be about politics. It shouldn't be about fear. It shouldn't be about any of these things. Now, I have family in that area, believe it or not. And the first thing I did was send a direct message to my family over there. Are you all right? And I wasn't going to talk about what he said back to me. I'm not going to say who this is, but he told me it was all right to quote him. And I'm gonna talk a little bit about what he said. But he has an ex-wife, he has kids there, and he has a fiance, and the fiance has kids, and that's a neighborhood where he would go to shop. And now these things are torched. And how do you think someone like that feels when they realize that could have been them there? What if they had been out shopping? What if you had been out shopping there? What would you think? The violence is wrong and it's got to stop. Police officer does something wrong, you charge him. People riot, you charge them. It's very simple. You don't, unless you want mob rule. Do you want mob rule? You won't like, take it from a Sicilian, you will not like arbitrary mob rule. You will not like it. You will not find it to your advantage. And speaking of finding it to the advantage, I'm going to pivot a second. But before I pivot one last time, let's say it one more time so it's easy to understand. There should be no trouble saying police going over the line is wrong. Doesn't matter the race of the police officer, doesn't matter the race of the person they were over the line on. People rioting is wrong. Doesn't matter the race of the people rioting, doesn't matter where they riot. They're both wrong. It should be easy to condemn these things. It should be easy for people to say, don't do this. And if necessary, have the police or the National Guard stop it. Now, that isn't actually easy. There's a lot of risk involved there. And I understand that there's a lot of risk involved there. And you got to be thankful for the people willing to take that risk and put themselves out there. And when I see people saying, I mean, I was reading, I've been reading stuff on Twitter. Twitter is probably the worst place to be at a time like this, because the ability to think and reason on this has not been all that strong. It really hasn't been all that strong. You gotta be, and it's very simple to think about, to throw out this or throw out that when it's not your neighborhood being torched, or it's not your friend who might have been killed there. But let's face it, there are people who are looking at this in terms of political advantage. I mean, you actually had people saying, well, you shouldn't be targeting the mom and pop businesses. Go after the corporations. We had a person on Twitter I was arguing with a couple of days, I think it was last night. Let me see if I can find the tweet. I wasn't going to use it, but it's a good example of what I'm talking about. There was actually a person arguing that they should not be hitting the mom and pop stores, that it's all right that Target was looted because they have insurance. So if Target gets looted, no big deal. Target has insurance. Think about what that's saying. It's all right if someone steals your car because you have insurance. It's all right if I break into your house and I rob it and torch it. It's okay. You have insurance. Seriously? This is what we're actually, I mean, people are actually making this argument on public platforms. That it's okay to torch Target because they've got insurance. What about the people who work there? What about the people who go there? Now, I'm not a fan of Target, frankly. I actually have a very old grudge with Target from 20 years ago, and I'm the type who keeps a grudge. I shouldn't be. I host a Catholic radio show. I shouldn't keep a grudge, but I got overcharged. I had a Target card. I went to get gas one day, and I missed the fact that they put an extra zero on it and charged me $76 instead of $760. And when I disputed it, they didn't allow the dispute because I hadn't looked. I should have looked, but I held that against Target. I hadn't shopped. Didn't go. It was 20 years before I bought anything there, and the only thing I bought there was a Monopoly Socialism because there was a run on it at the time. But I have carry no water for Target. I hold a grudge very well, and it's a trivial thing to hold a grudge over, but the people who shop there are hurt. The people who work there are hurt. And the neighborhood is hurt because will you want to put yourself back in there? Will you want that business back in there? Would you? What sane person, if they know that the police are not going to protect, are going to let rioters riot? What sane person puts a business back there? Would you risk your capital, your hard-earned labor, or your stockholders' money in the case of Target, for example, because it's a publicly traded corporation? Do you risk your stockholders' money there? It's a bad risk. Now the insurance is going to go way up. No, all it hurts is the people there. I mean, the rioters might, you're a rioter. You might get a flat screen TV over it. Is it worth it? Is it worth it? I mean, not only is it bad, but the fact that people are defending it is ridiculous. However, it's consistent with the tech guy's laws of media outrage. For those of you who are new, and there's a lot of new faces I can see here, the tech guy's law of media outrages are the 4 laws so far. I might come up with more, by which you can always know how the media is going to react in any situation. And the tech guy's second law of media outrage applies here. And this is what the second law of media outrage says. Quote, the level of acceptance of the positions and or actions of any group or organization by the left in media is directly proportional to their current or potential value in electing liberal Democrats. We have already seen people play, this is Trump's fault, this is Trump's America. There are people here who are actually hoping, this is going to energize the black vote for election 2020. I would hope that the black vote is not that much of a sucker, be played this way. I would hope that. We had one person saying, this is Trump's America. This is all Trump's fault. Now, I'd like to remind people of something. Donald Trump was elected in 2016 and was sworn in January 20th of 2017. Now, I'm going to show you something. See this picture? This is a before picture. That's me. That's me from my class picture in 4th grade at St. Anthony de Padua Grammar School in 1972. I had hair and everything. I was still overweight. You can't tell by this, but my mother saved this picture. This was a picture she had of me. My oldest son looks like that too, although he's starting to lose hair as well. But that's a picture of me. And the reason why I'm showing you this picture of me is because the last time Minnesota voted for a Republican was around the year this picture was taken. The last time that Minneapolis had a Republican as a mayor was about the time this picture was taken. Now, I don't know how it's a kind of sad commentary that you get from here to here in about 50 years, but that's just life. I wasn't a bad looking kid back then. Wasn't as smart. I mean, I thought it was smart, but you know how it is when you're a kid. But the point is, people are blaming Donald Trump for this in Minnesota, which last voted for a Republican in the Nixon landslide of 1972. Minneapolis' last Republican mayor left in 1973. How is it that 40 years of liberal progressive utopia produces this? How can this be? This is impossible. I mean, if you think about this, how do you blame Donald Trump for this? How do you blame the Republicans for this? The left has had control of this city forever. And it gets ridiculous. And I'm going to read you this story. I literally just saw it 3 minutes before the podcast began, and I looked at it and I presumed it was the Babylon Bee. For those of you who don't know, the Babylon Bee is a Christian news parody site. They put out things like an example of, from now on, we're just putting out Biden's quotes verbatim because, they can't parody on it, or person hits Tim Tebow with a pitched ball, turns into a pillar of salt, that kind of thing. They do parody news. Well, this is the headline, and I kid you not. But I'm going to give everyone 5 seconds. If you're drinking something, to put it down. Put down whatever you're drinking before I read you the headline of this piece, because I don't want you to ruin your phone or whatever it is you're watching this on. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Minneapolis mayor gives masks to crowding rioters after warning in-person worship would be a public health disaster. I'm going to read that again. Minneapolis mayor gives masks to crowding rioters in person after in-person worship would be public health disaster. So, and I'm going to read you a little bit about this piece. Before George Floyd died in police custody this week, triggering destructive riots as large crowds protested in Minneapolis, the city's mayor, Jacob Frey, warned that allowing 25% capacity in churches would be, quote, a recipe in Minneapolis for a public health disaster due to coronavirus. Now, as the city is overwhelmed by crowds causing property damage and clashing with police, Frey's own government said that it is giving out masks to the rioters, even though the state has prohibited gatherings of 10 or more because of the pandemic. I'm not going to read you the whole story. It's at foxnews.com politics. I found it via Instapundit. But think about that for a second. You're giving the rioters masks so they don't spread the coronavirus? I'm running out of words to describe that. That's just, you couldn't, the Babylon Bee, you can't parody that. How do you parody that? It's ridiculous. It's astoundingly stupid. And it's so astoundingly stupid. How do you do that? How do you justify that? How do you make that argument that you've destroyed 50, 100 businesses. So what are we going to do? We're going to give you masks because at least you won't spread the pandemic. Now, I'm going to read you 2 things in a row. I'm going to read you a piece by Robert Stacey McCain, and then I'm going to read you those direct messages that I got from my relative who lives in St. Paul, Minneapolis. Before I do those things, I want to point out that, again, the actions of the police were outrageous. The police officers, they're outrageous. But I think it's just as outrageous that people are rioting. I also think it's just as outrageous that quite a few black people were killed in Chicago this weekend, and nobody seems to worry about that. I think it's outrageous that quite a few people in Baltimore have been shot in the last week, and no one's outraged about that. I think it's outrageous that Black lives only matter if someone thinks they can get a political win out of it. And I think it's rather amazing that this has come back to bite one of Joe Biden's potential running mates, Amy Klobuchar, who apparently had a chance to prosecute this guy in a previous incident, didn't do it. But that's her problem. Now, this is the piece from Robert Stacey McCain, and I point this out because the media, I should say, are very selective in what they report. And I don't often give Sally Cohn a lot of credit, but I want to give her a little bit of credit here, is that she pointed out that the peaceful protesters, and there were people who were peacefully protesting as well, they don't generate the eyeballs that the rioters do. So the media shoots for that, because the riots will generate eyeballs. Because the media's out to they're out for the clicks, they're out for the money. They're out to make a living. And there's more money in people watching a place riot. What she doesn't have right is comparing apples and oranges protesters. Now, I'm going to read this piece. My eyes aren't what they are, so I'm going to have to use a second pair of glasses here. I know it looks ridiculous, but that's just life. This is from Stacey McCain, and he has a tweet up from Seth Kaplan of the 3rd precinct of the Minneapolis Police Department. The fire at the corner is growing. Anarchy in Minneapolis, Democrats who celebrate rioters who burnt down city. Anarchy is the worst of evils that can affect a people. Societies can survive the cruelty of tyrants and the blunders of demographic government and the blunders of democratic governments. I couldn't wreck out what he wrote there. But anarchy, the destruction of law, brings about a state of affairs in which no man's life or property is safe. Minneapolis did not have to go up in flames Thursday night. I watched live in real time as authorities surrendered the city to the mob. The mayor seems to be a sort of worthless liberal one typically finds in California, and the media's role in fomenting this riot was familiar. Endless replaying of the video of a racial incident on cable news. He has incident in quotes, and I'm not sure those quotes are appropriate, so that the audience is subjected to the image of George Floyd being suffocated to death over and over and over. The media don't do this because they're interested in social justice. They do it because they believe that this kind of coverage will help energize black voters and thus elect more Democrats. And when predictably there's a backlash against this media-driven political narrative, when people reject the intended message, the result is condemned as proof of white racism. Lather, rinse, repeat. And he has an embed of a tweet from Caleb Hull, MSNBC reporter right now, quote, I want to be clear on how I characterize this. This is mostly a protest. It is not, generally speaking, unruly. The guy is literally standing in front of a burning building in the middle of a riot. Once you've been through a few of these cycles, you cease to be surprised by the irresponsibility of the media who incite violent disorders. Quote, protests over the police death of George Floyd continued well into the morning Friday after a third night of violence in Minneapolis, where similar disturbances broke out in Louisville and other parts of the country. Late Thursday, demonstrators set fire to a police precinct building in the Minneapolis neighborhood where Floyd died Monday after he was restrained by a Minneapolis police officer, Derek Chauvin, I believe it's pronounced, who knelt on his neck. Floyd had been arrested on suspicion of using a counterfeit bill at a grocery store. And I'm sorry, when I read that, I cringe. You're not really afraid of your life there. I cringe when I read that. The precinct building had been evacuated by order of the Minneapolis mayor, Jacob Frey, who said he was unwilling to endanger lives to protect the building. Quote, I understand the importance of a precinct, he said, but the symbolism of a building cannot outweigh the importance of life of our officers or the public. We could not risk serious injury to anyone, and we will continue to patrol the 3rd precinct entirely. At 4:30 a.m. Friday, protesters and looters were still out in the streets and the neighborhood as several nearby commercial buildings burned unchecked. Firefighters arrived shortly afterwards, accompanied by the state police in riot gear, who began to arrest people in the area, including a CNN reporter and crew members. And speaking of stupid, that was stupid too. I'm not a fan of CNN, but that was stupid. These guys were clearly reporters. They're offering to move to wherever the police say to move to. That was stupid. That was stupid. It's not criminal, but it's stupid. And those guys should get at least a very strong talking to on that. That's just, I mean, I understand you're in the middle of a situation, your adrenaline's pumping, but you're not in danger from that. That crew isn't a danger to you. That was just stupid. CNN correspondent Officer Jimenez and 3 crew members were taken into custody live on air. The news organization immediately criticized the arrest and called for their release. CNN President Jeff Zucker and Minnesota Governor Tim Walz deeply apologized for the arrest. They were released after about an hour in custody, CNN said. The unrest also spread to neighboring St. Paul, where protesters looted a Target store and set fire to several businesses along a busy commercial corridor. Early in the night, National Guard troops were deployed in the 2 cities at Walz's order. The governor said he issued the order at the request of local leaders who called on the state government for the National Guard resources after, quote, extensive damage to private property, unquote, occurred during the protests. The idea, and again, this is Stacey McCain again, the idea that these criminals were protesters or demonstrators is an insult to the intelligence of anyone who watched, and the videos were streaming all over Twitter, as thieves and vandals not only destroyed a police precinct station, but looted and damaged some 170 businesses. The media, however, continued promoting the narrative that anyone who condemned the riots was thereby endorsing police brutality. This is what students of logic call the false dilemma fallacy, pretending that there are only two possible alternatives, in this case being pro-riot or pro-racism, when many other viewpoints exist. Something that Andrew Breitbart always said: turn the cameras around, make the media's story, expose their tactics, call out their errors. And there's one other thing about this that's significant concerning what Stacey McCain has said. If they think this is going to get votes for the Democrats, they are wrong. Now I'm going to read you these tweets, and I want to preface this by saying the following. My relative in Minnesota, I've known since he was born. He's a nice guy. He's a good man. However, politically, he's about as left as they come. We argue over politics all the time. He cannot stand Donald Trump. He's a Democrat through and through. And whenever I've had something to say concerning the left and Trump, he always has tweaked me over it. And he's got wit and brains too, so he's good at tweaking me. I sent him a tweet, a private message, because I wanted to make sure he was all right. I mean, he's family. And the first tweet he sent reply was that he was all right. And he noted that the plot, as far as he knows, his ex-wife and his kids are fine. His fiance and her kid are okay. Although the plaza he shops at by his house are all looted, burned down, and destroyed. They had planned to go out to a cabin tomorrow, but decided to leave this morning. Side note: these are his words. This is a fanatical Democrat who has never liked anything Trump. All in for the Democrats until 48 hours ago. With the bullshit coverage of the riot by the mainstream media and the non-action of the Minnesota leadership during the riots, I will wait in line for hours in a mask and vote for Trump in November. When I read that to my wife, I thought she was going to faint. And he's over, and I asked him permission. Do you want me to? Can I quote this? He says, it's all right to quote. It's ridiculous. The Democrat leadership are now admitting they acted slow. Well, no shit. They tried to appease the black community, and they rioted and burned down the cities regardless, and speak against the violence, and you are a racist and a Trumper. Now, this was a vote in Minnesota that the Democrats had in their pocket. I wonder how many people in Minneapolis and St. Paul who, remember, that's a Democrat stronghold. The state has not voted for a Republican for president since 1972. Minneapolis has not voted for a Republican mayor since 1973. The last one left office. It was the last time they voted for one was before then. What do you think is going to happen next to this fall? How do you think the people of Minnesota seeing this? How many of them are who actually go into these neighborhoods, who actually visit these businesses, who actually saw the liberal mayor and the governor and such stand back and let this happen? And remember, right away, the president said, we're doing a civil rights investigation on this, and I don't need two glasses to read now. How do you think they're going to react? There's an old joke about a conservative being a liberal who's mugged by reality. Well, there's a reason why Sicilian neighborhoods are safe. I'm going to just leave it at that. There's a reason why you don't see rioting in a Sicilian neighborhood. But that shouldn't be the way a neighborhood is protected. The left that's going all in on this is screwing themselves. And frankly, I mean, I would like Trump to win re-election. I don't pretend otherwise. But I'm not a big fan of riots and destruction. If the choice is between Trump winning Minnesota and 170 businesses being destroyed and looting going on, I'll do without Minnesota. can still win without it. I don't want people's businesses rioted. You got 170 businesses. Do you know how much I've run a business? I opened a business when I was 25. It's hard work. I have a small business in addition. This is part of my small business. I got to do the bookkeeping. I got to do the taxes. I got to pay my writers, which reminds me, I got to pay my writers tomorrow. Got to remember to do that tomorrow. There's a lot of work involved. Now, when you own a retail store, that's even more work. You work 50, 60, 70, 100 hours when you own a small business. You put your guts into it. Some weeks you don't take home a paycheck because you got to cover the bills. You got to cover the people who work for you. You got all this paperwork the state and such gives you. Now 170 of these are gone. All the sweat those people put in there is gone. As a guy who ran a business, I know what that is, and it just destroys you inside because you put your heart and soul into businesses like that. And even to the corporate-owned ones, there are people who worked hard in those places for years who have gone up the ladder, maybe started out as a clerk, got to a manager or an assistant manager, worked hard to make something of themselves. Now those jobs are gone. Like that. Because you had a mayor and a governor who weren't willing to protect them. That's horrible. That's horrible. And you know what? It was unnecessary. The officer has been arrested. The officer has been charged with third-degree murder. If the riots didn't take place, the officer still would have been arrested and still would have been charged. It's not the right thing is generally the smart thing. And that's something I've been saying for a very long time. This was not the right thing. And this was not the smart thing. This is bad. This is bad moves, bad ideas. And I got to tell you, if you're a person who thinks this is going to be to your advantage, remember, and you're saying this on Twitter and saying, oh, all these people are saying this on Twitter. Let me remind you of something I say a lot. Twitter isn't real life. Act accordingly. Twitter is, and Glenn Reynolds put it best, Twitter is like a reverse iceberg. An iceberg, you see 10% of it on the surface and 90% is underneath. My relative in Minneapolis, he's like that 90% underneath, who generally, they don't pay attention to this. They've got their lives to worry. They've got their jobs to worry about. They got their kids to worry about. They're not worried about this stuff every day. I worry about it because I write about it. And frankly, I've been into politics since I was 9. Baseball since I was 5. Politics since I was 9. And history since I was 6. Because my dad served in World War II. My grandparents were born in the 19th century, believe it or not. But that's as it were. But most people, they don't care about this stuff. They care about their lives, their jobs and stuff. That 90% under the water you're going to hear from in the fall. But Twitter, that 90% of what you see on Twitter maybe represents 10% below the surface who aren't there. It's all smoke. Now, I use Twitter to promote my site and promote my blog, to promote this podcast. Most of you who are watching today probably saw the link on Twitter. And because I'm in the afternoon, maybe I should do this in the afternoons from now on because I'm getting a better audience. I'm following it because and maybe you agree, maybe you disagree. I see the chat's full. And I like seeing the chat full. In fact, I should say thank you to everyone, by the way. Thanks for coming and watching. H-I-N-G. All right. Yes, this is a low frills podcast. For those of you joining for the first time, my goal in doing this podcast weekly is 2 things. I want to drive a little more traffic to the site. I'm trying to raise about an extra $180 a month in my tip jar to pay some bills. That's the reason why I do the podcast every week. And I used to have a radio show. I had DaTechGuy on the radio for 5 or 6 years, syndicated. A lot of you probably never heard of me. Some of you might have. But if you're here, I'm glad that you've come. If you like what you see, up arrow it. If you don't like it, that's fine too. But you like it or don't like it, glad to have you. Very happy to share some time with you and share my opinion. So let's bottom line this. Bottom line number one, what the police did was clearly wrong. And it's wrong not because it was done to a black man, but because it was done to a man. The action was wrong. The race, in my mind, is incidental. It might not be incidental to other, but the crime was the crime. The crime is just as bad, would have been just as bad and just as worthy of the murder charge if it had been any other race, any other religion, any other sex, any other group of whatever. It's the crime that's wrong. The rioting is wrong. Not because it's black people rioting, but because it's people rioting. If it's wrong, it's wrong, it's wrong. And we have to look at things this way. If something's only wrong if one particular group does it, then we're setting up a standard. You're giving people a pass. You don't want to give people a pass. Frankly, there's two things that you need. First of all, you need the punishment for the actions of the police to be strong enough to deter them from doing it again. Third-degree murder charge, that's pretty strong. You also need the punishment for the rioters strong enough so they don't do it again. As long as if you reward behavior, you get more of it. The police officer involved in this was suspected of involved in stuff several different times and was let off the hook each time. Now, some of those times might have been valid. There was one situation that I was reading about where a guy had literally just killed his friend and girlfriend and was armed. That's a situation where you might be afraid for your life. But that's just the way it is. That's just the way it is. I don't know if my son just came into the view. Hopefully not. But just back from work. But that's what's going on here. It should not be difficult to condemn the violence and to say the violence that both situations are wrong. This is not hard. Why is this hard for people? Because people are dividing into camps. And again, they're looking at this in political advantage instead of from right and wrong. There's a reason why right and wrong are important. There's a reason, and I speak this as an author of a Catholic book. My book, this is my book, by the way, if you have an interest. It's called Hail Mary, the Perfect Protestant and Catholic Prayer. You can also catch my radio show, by the way, on terrestrial radio every Saturday at noon on WQPH 89.3 FM, Shirley Fitchburg. It's called Your Prayer Intentions. We pray for people's prayer intentions. That's what's going on. You got to look at things in the sense of right and wrong. It should not be hard to condemn both. It really shouldn't. Now I want to switch topics for a second, to the topic that this was originally going to be about. Today's podcast, I actually had all lined up. I knew exactly what we were going to be talking about. And what we were going to be talking about is the president as a Jacksonian. And now I'm a blogger. I've been blogging at my own site since 2008. And I used to blog for a company I worked for called Highwired. And there were some bloggers who came around before me. And one of the great ones was a fellow by the name of Steve Denbesty. He died in 2016. And he wrote a piece a while back that came to mind when I was thinking of President Trump about Jacksonians. And I want to read you this piece because one of the things that has been amazing about what's gone on with the president and his big fight with Twitter lately has been I don't see how people do not understand the president. I just don't see how they don't understand him. And to understand him, you have to understand he's a Jacksonian. By the way, you can find the piece I'm about to read you at my blog, DaTechGuy.com. That's DaTechGuy.com. And by the way, if you like this podcast, all of my podcasts and all the interviews I've ever done, I've done a ton of interviews from questioning President Trump at press conferences while he was a candidate to a series of interviews called Interviews with Immigrants, which I think is my best work. You can find it all on my YouTube channel. But I want to read you this piece. It's called The Late Steve Denbesty on Trump Accidentally. And I think I can read this without the extra pair of glasses. Yesterday, I used a line from an old piece from the late Stephen Denbesti's spectacular blog, USS Clueless, to describe why Donald Trump has no issue using the Lori Klaus's case versus Joe Scarborough. Rereading the piece in question, it occurs to me that in this post, Mr. Denbesti, despite dying in 2016 before the Trump presidency, managed to sum up what he would be like a full 15 years before it happened. This is the piece. And this is original pieces from 2002. This is Stephen Denbesti's writing. For about the fifth time in a week, I have written a longish response to a reader and then decided it would make a good post instead. It's the way of leveraging my time, I guess. It gives me the liberty of spending a long time on a response in the letter. Dave from the UK discovered my site a couple of days ago and wrote me about it. I answered some of his questions and noted how he seemed puzzled by what some Americans do. So I pointed him to Walter Russell Mead's brilliant article describing the influence of Jacksonianism on American foreign policy. Now, I should point out, Andrew Jackson is President Trump's favorite president. He talks about Andrew Jackson. He likes Andrew Jackson, and he's mentioned this in the past. This is significant. Dave responded to that with an attempt to claim that it seemed to him that it should be in the interest of Jacksonians to support world government and world rule of law. He didn't understand our deep antipathy to it. I suppose I shouldn't mention that I don't totally align with pure Jacksonianism as described by Mead. For one thing, it relies heavily on a strong religious tradition, and this is Denbesti saying, I'm an atheist, but I identify much more strongly with the Jacksonian policy than I do with any other of the three that Mead describes, Solian and Hamiltonian and Jeffersonian. So quoting Dave and inspiring my responses. There is a particular attitude that Mr. Mead attributes to the Jacksonian party in his piece, which seems to be more dogma than sense. The assumption that any attempt to establish an international framework is doomed to failure. This is a nihilistic argument. Later in the piece, Mr. Mead cites the post-World War II reconstruction of West Germany and Japan as being within the Jacksonian tradition and positive for the common good. This I accept and agree with. I've always thought that small government, free enterprise tradition of the United States was its greatest strength. Quote, the business of America is business, unquote. And for immigrants willing to work, the streets can be paved with gold. But free enterprise requires regulation and rule of law to work. Without it, all transactions are COD, so all economies are limited by the high street. For the Jacksonian party to be proper and thrive in their individual and self-sufficient tradition, then, on a national, international level, they must accept a degree of regulation and rule of law for free trade and function correctly. Economically crippled, post-World War I Germany led to World War II. Economically viable and internationally linked post-World War II Germany made the concept of war unthinkable. And that's the letter they got. He's over there. It really isn't dogma. It's just realism. And this, I think, applies to the riots, too. Jacksonians know that there are really nasty people out there and know that it is impossible to avoid dealing with them. There always have been nasty people. There always will be in the future. Jacksonian foreign policy is crafted to succeed even when other people are pricks. And again, I pardon the language. This is Denbesti's piece. Jacksonians don't consider the pacification of Germany to be the result of law or diplomacy. They could think it's because of the result of the American military occupation. To put it simple, European peace was made possible by an American threat of war, 50 years of occupation by several American divisions and other military assets. This was a critical difference between 1820 and 1946. In 1920, American Wilsonians tried to use diplomacy and the concept of international law and cooperation and friendship and trust, and failed. In 1946, Americans Jacksonians used military power instead and succeeded. Now think a second about the riots. The mayor and the governor tried to appease the rioters, like the Wilsonians in the 1920s tried to appease Germany. Didn't work out all that well for them, did it? Back to the piece. George Marshall epitomizes the Jacksonian approach to things. During World War II, as the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Marshall, as top military officer in the U.S., led us to total victory over Germany, Italy, and Japan. After the war, as Secretary of State, Marshall, as the top diplomatic officer of the U.S., led us to a lasting peace and friendship with those same nations. He was resolute in war and forgiving and generous in peace, and won both the war and the peace. But he didn't become friendly and generous to Germany, Italy, and Japan until after they had been totally defeated. And 1,000 years of Western European war ended by American military occupation, which is why Jacksonians find Europe preaching against our military might to be ironic and deeply hypocritical. Europe has disarmed and ceased to rely on military power, but is only capable of doing so because of American military strength. Europeans didn't need armies to threaten each other because they were all being threatened by us as a neutral outsider. Jacksonians don't think that international frameworks and international cooperation are impossible or unnecessary. But Jacksonians believe that such frameworks should be limited, concentrated, and closely monitored. Cooperation is possible without trust if it's backed with vigilance and the will to retaliate for cheating. Retaliation can take many forms, of course. It's not exclusively military. And pay attention to this paragraph. And to Jacksonians, trust is foolhardy. There are a lot of good people out there, but there are also a lot of bastards. And if you turn your back, someone will stab you in it. Trust but verify is a purely Jacksonian watchword. Those who act honorably will be treated honorably. Those who cheat will be crushed. There is, however, totally opposite to the more utopian vision of Wilsonians and some Europeans of a new international order, based not on vigilance and retaliation, but rather on goodwill and cooperation and friendship. Were that possible, the result would be wonderful. But Jacksonians think that such ideas are delusional. There are just too many out there waiting for an opportunity to cheat. Just like appeasing the people who rioting in Minnesota was ridiculous, because there are too many people waiting for the chance to get a 5-finger discount at Target. In fact, trust does work in some cases. There are people out there who are honorable, but it's better not to depend on it, and Jacksonians don't think it's necessary to do so. Jacksonians are always prepared for betrayal because it will happen somewhere by someone eventually. Structures we require to maintain international trade can be sustained without trust of any kind of world government. Such international frameworks work quite well as long as they're limited, monitored, and enforced by a threat of war and other retaliation. Pay attention, this part is important. What won't work is any kind of utopian world government where the people of the world band together in peace and harmony and brotherhood and cooperate with each other just because they're such nice folks and all. They ain't. Just like people who are saying we should disband police forces. Doesn't work that way. People don't obey the law. And you just saw what happened. The police force retreated, 170 businesses looted. Back to the peace. Probably a lot of them are. There are always going to be bad apples, and there will always be some who cheat if they think they can get away with it. Such people will react to scolding and other toothless diplomatic reactions to their cheating with contempt. The only solution for them is to nail them to the wall. The rule of law works within our nation because it's enforced by police and the courts. The rule of international law because we are willing to fight when others ignore it if we think the issues involved are sufficiently important. By Jacksonian lights, no rule of law works without the threat of force. And if the threat of force is removed, then lawbreakers will come out of the woodwork. And sometimes they'll appear anyway, which is why war will always be with us and why good Jacksonians make sure that the nation always remains military strong. That sounds like Donald Trump there. But notice what he said about the threat of force removed. When the threat of the police being there in that precinct was removed, they torched it. And 170 businesses went down. This is significant. Having police and courts doesn't prevent crime, but it does give us the ability to deal with it. By that same token, having a strong military doesn't prevent the need for war, but it does give us a better chance of winning it when the time comes. Nobody wants a war, but if you have to fight one, it's much better to win it than to lose it. And the police do deter some crime, and having a strong military does prevent some threats of war. Jacksonians are deeply practical. Perfect solutions aren't possible, and this one is the best available to us. While it's true that some degree of international regulation is required in order for trade and other international dealings to take place, Jacksonians are always suspicious of such regulations, so they want to make sure that the regulators don't have an ulterior motive and make sure that everyone is playing by the same rules. The situation works because it's subject to constant scrutiny and because we don't go overboard relying on it. Think Joe Biden's son in China and Ukraine, for example. Basically, Jacksonians believe that others will play fair, but some of them will only do so as long as they're being watched. And it's this trust rejection of international government. The Jacksonian Party hurts us. Now, this is the other guy talking. The Jacksonian Party hurts itself of Jacksonian traditions, and the goals of free enterprise and self-reliance can be spread globally, be a global free trade. Without it, their capacity to prosper within the U.S. is constrained and ultimately doomed. Here's his answer. Jacksonians don't have any interest in spreading their philosophy around the world. It isn't evangelistic. Instead, the entire concept of trying to actively spread that or any other philosophy around the world is deeply repugnant to pure Jacksonians. Jacksonians are anti-imperialistic. The whole part of Jacksonian is this: you leave me alone, I'll leave you alone. You play fair with me, I'll play fair with you. And pardon my language, because this is in the piece. But if you fuck with me, I'll kill you. To Jacksonians, it is entirely possible to create an adequate world framework of constant and fair behavior, sufficient to support trade through vigilance and the threat of reprisal, military or otherwise. Going beyond that to a world government as such is neither necessary, desirable, nor even possible. In the best case, where there is as little international framework and governance as can be, only the bare minimum required, but no more. Anything beyond this will eventually be abused by someone, so it's better to do without it. Wilsonians want a world government. Jacksonians think that's a fool's quest. And contrary to your supposition, again, he's talking to the person who wrote, world government is required for successful international trade. The reality is that the last 50 years of international trade were managed under Jacksonian principles and quite successfully true. Free trade inside the U.S. works because of the threat of force implicit in the police and the courts. Free trade works internationally because we are strong, alert, and willing to retaliate against those who cross us. To Jacksonians, that is sufficient. Nothing else is needed, and nothing else can work. Now, I defy anyone to read that, who just heard that piece, to tell me that he's not talking about Donald Trump. This is exactly how President Trump has reacted. In fact, the spat with Joe Scarborough, which is finally going to be pushed off of the front pages because of the riots in Minnesota, which is the only redeeming factor in all of it, it's all Jacksonian. You play fair with me, I'll play fair with you. You F with me, as he said in that piece, and I'll come after you. That's what Trump did. That's how Trump operates. If anyone reading that piece, and remember, that was written in 2002. You'd think it was written about the president today. You really would. So Trump is a Jacksonian. If you think of Trump as a Jacksonian, you'll understand. And think of the Jacksonian principles involved in what went on. The police officer involved, now charged with third-degree murder, arrested and fired first, then arrested, then charged. A third-degree murder charge is a pretty strong deterrent, especially for a police officer. Police officers do not do well in prison. There are too many people with long memories there. That's a deterrent. Rioting is not a deterrent. Letting people riot is not a deterrent. And pretending that if we just let the rioters riot and sit back, all will be well is not a deterrent. The lesson that the people who rioted learned was that I can get a free TV. I can destroy things if I want to because they're afraid of me and they won't stop me. That's a bad lesson to teach people. The lesson that the voters of Minneapolis are learning is that if you're not willing to protect me this time, why would I assume you'll protect me next time? I think we need to be more Jacksonian in the way we think. We need to look at people realistically. A basic assumption of Christianity, and I'm a very Catholic person, is that people are sinners by their nature and that Christ saves us. Now, the various denominations may say, oh, you have to do it by the church, may have to do it. But the basic idea of Christianity, Jesus Christ is the Son of God, he saves us. So we have to be protected from ourselves because we're sinners. The basic idea of Jacksonianism is the same. People can be no good. It's the nature of people to do wrong. Or as the founding fathers put it, if men were angels, no government would be needed. That's the way Donald Trump governs. That's the way he looks at things. And I suspect that's the way he's going to deal with what's going on in Minneapolis. And the more people look at things realistically the way they are, the better off we're going to be. Because I'm going to tell you something about reality. Reality does not care about your political philosophy. Reality does not care about your ideology. It doesn't even care about your religion or anything else or your race. Reality is. The reality is, if you leave the streets to the mob, The mob is going to rule, and you're going to have to live under the mob. You don't want to live under the mob. The reality is, if you let other foreign countries step on you, or let people take money from other foreign governments to do various things for their advantage, they're going to do it. The reality is, like mail-in voting, for example, the reality is that with literally billions of dollars of spending going, if you make it easier to cheat and people have a financial interest in cheating and a particular person getting elected, they're going to cheat, especially if they think they're not going to be punished by at least half of the courts or whatever amount of courts are appointed by Democrats. These are the realities. Jacksonians look at things realistically. Donald Trump looks at things realistically because he's had to run a business, and I'm sympathetic to that because I've had to run a business. I was a Ted Cruz guy. One of my sons was a Ben Carson guy. This is actually a Ben Carson shirt from the campaign. You want to never have to buy shirts again, cover a campaign, because they give out some nice T-shirts. Those are the realities. If you look at things realistically, you'll know what to do. Well, that's all the time we've had. We've done about an hour today. I want to thank you. We've had a pretty good audience. Maybe I should do the afternoons more often. In fact, I think next week we'll do it again. 3:00. Instead, forget 9:30 in the morning. 3:00 next Friday. Be here. We'll do DaTechGuy on the radio, off the radio again. Next Friday at 3:00. Just made that spur of the moment decision. You can do that when it's your business. Now, remind you, if you like what you saw, consider giving the podcast an up arrow. Give it to your friends. Send it over. Let them decide what they think. If they like it, great. If they don't like it, that's fine too. I don't care if people agree with me or disagree with me. Your opinion is just as worthwhile as mine. You have the right to it just as much as me. Second, if you really like it, consider subscribing to the podcast and to my channel. I'd like to monetize it. I'm about 200 subscribers short. If you subscribe or have some of your friends subscribe, that would be great. Finally, as I said at the beginning of the podcast, the reason why I started the Tech Guy off the radio, which is kind of a continuation of my old syndicated radio show, is because I'm trying to get about an extra 180 a month in terms of tip jar hits. Now, we already made our goal, and I want to thank people who did it. We got a couple of tip jar hits this week for $10 yesterday, $20 the day before. Really appreciate it because it helps pay my writers, because the writers on my site, I pay them. I don't pay them a lot. I'm not a rich guy, but I pay them. So you're helping to pay for that and pay for my bandwidth costs, which have been going up because the traffic's been going up since the podcast and so forth. So if you really like what you see, consider hitting the tip jar. I'd appreciate it. And if you want to hear more from me on a totally different subject, as I said, every Saturday, the radio show is Your Prayer Intentions, WQPH 89.3 FM, Shirley, Fitchburg. The live stream is available online if you're from Central Massachusetts. On dial, it's 89.3. And if you ever have a prayer request you want us to pray for on the air, just email it to me, tweet it to me, or put it up on the prayer wall at wqphradio.org/prayer wall. We'll pray for it on the show. If you don't want to use your name, you want an anonymous thing, just put anonymous request. That's fine. Happy to do it. Well, again, that's all the time we have. Thank you for joining us for the Tech Guy off the radio, or the Tech Guy's afternoon court. And I now declare the Tech Guy's afternoon court adjourned for the day. You guys have a great rest of the weekend and stay safe. If you're in the Minneapolis area, stay safe. Best of luck to everybody.